what we'll see here is a little bit more of Robert Macbeth's influence in terms of convincing Alexander Ross to commit to the arts and crafts a little bit more. And we can see straight away in this image here, we've got the banded columns are appearing straight away. So this is a quick overview of the site. You can see the old Crown House here. This is the road that's at the top of Stephen's Brae that goes around the site, which I've put in there just so that you've got, gives you a bit of scale and context in terms of where the building is sitting. And we'll just have a close in on the site here and have a look at it. While both of these buildings were finished in 1895, the Inverness Royal Academy had been in development for much, much longer than the Rose Street Foundry had been. There had been plans to redevelop the Royal Academy since the 1870s. When the Academy was built in Academy Street, it was a much different street than it was in the 1870s because there was no railway and it wasn't the same amount of noise or pollution that was involved, and the buildings were quite new. By the Education Act in Scotland came in 1872, and throughout the 1870s we see lots of new school buildings being built to a much higher standard, much better space for the students to learn in, much better lighting, much better ventilation. And by this stage, the Inverness Royal Academy was starting to look a bit tired. It was looking small, it was looking cramped. It was in the middle of a very noisy street in Academy Street, and we had all the noise of the trains going back and forth round about it, making it almost intolerable for both the teachers and the students. So there have been plans to redevelop a new academy for quite a long period of time. And Alexander Ross was first involved in this project in 1888, which is 7 or 8 years before the building was actually finished. And he and the new rector, Bruce, went off to Edinburgh and Glasgow on a study trip together, specifically to look at all the new school buildings that were being built in Edinburgh and Glasgow to develop the ideal model for an academy, and they would use that in Inverness. Unfortunately, it would take them quite a while to find the right site on which to build the academy. So the plans lay in abeyance for a few years until eventually they were able to secure the site and develop it. But the requirements of the building were very different from the foundry building. And we can see that the arrangement is a smaller spans in terms of the width of the bays of the building. And we've got this big open central hall space that's going to go into the middle. Here we are. This central hall space, now, it may seem similar to the framework that went into the Rose Street Foundry, but it's not quite. We're still using ironwork here rather than steel. So while we're getting a lot of light flooding in, it's quite a different structural principles that are involved and rather more traditional. One interesting thing is this is the original Academy building that sat on Academy Street, and we have the 2 bays at either end and then this recessed central panel, which has been recreated within the new Inverness Royal Academy. So when we look at the composition of the whole space, we've got these 2 projecting bays at either end and then a recessed central panel in the middle. You need to use something like this to break up such a big form, because otherwise it becomes rather oppressive. It's just too big and it's too imposing. So you need to break up the facade a little bit and create recessed panels and projecting panels. One way to do it is to have the central section projecting forwards, but that's quite an assertive move. It can put some people off as an expression of authority. The other way is to recess it backwards and create what's called a cour d'honneur, which is a kind of impression, a suggestion of a courtyard, which creates a space before you enter the building. If we look at the proportions of the building, we can see we've got this square proportional system that's going. But when I mentioned in the introduction, a kind of a 4 square elongated system is quite radical and quite dramatic, and is probably too early in the, or it's not early enough for the Victorian period, but for the modern movement, but it's too late really for the Victorian period. And there's kind of a little bit of a design work involved in terms of how do we deal with this kind of horizontal emphasis and break it back and trying to bring it back to something a little bit more harmonious. So the double square of the recessed panel is now kind of working in contrast or complementing the single square end bays. And the other thing they introduce is the buttresses on the corners, which give us this vertical emphasis, which balances the horizontal movement of the proportional system. And these buttresses are entirely gratuitous. They're not required at all. They don't really perform any structural function. And you know, if you want proof of that, all you have to do is look at the entrance bay here. This tiny little bay with these great big buttresses. It's not required. It's just there for visual effect. Interestingly, the space again in front of the schoolyard space in front of the entrance has got this double square proportional system, which is identical to the one that's on the elevation. So we get this very close relationship between the external space that's in front of the building and then the height of the building, which creates this harmony and a wonderful kind of sense of ease that's there. Within each of these bays, again, we can do more analysis and we can break up the facade and we can find within each of these bays, we can find golden section rectangles and squares. And then within each of the windows themselves, you'll see that they're split up into different smaller proportions as well. So this whole thing, like breaking down a big form into smaller forms, is continuing through the building. So let's look at some of the detail on this building. This is not the academy that's up at Midmills. This is the academy that's down on Academy Street. And Alexander Ross, before Robert Macbeth joined the partnership, Alexander Ross did some improvement work for the academy down there, and he produced this doorway, which you can still see beside M & Co down in the town. And he's got this wonderful detail. Again, it's this kind of, I wouldn't say obsession, but this real interest that Ross has in creating this wonderful detail that people can look at when they're close at the building and kind of get this enjoyment. And if we have a wee look at the close-up, you'll see in here we've got little set squares, and we've got a painter's easel and paint brushes. And then on the other side, we can see we've got an ionic column here, and we've got some workshop material here, some planes, I think, and some saws, some chisels perhaps. So it's kind of illustrating the activities that the students are learning inside. So if we have a look at the Royal Academy building, and again, we've got a very similar detail to what's at the foundry with this arched window at the first floor level, where he fills the tympanum, that's this kind of space underneath the arch, with these wonderful sculptural reliefs. And on one side, we've got a lady doing a painting here, and she's showing this cherub, or maybe teaching this cherub how to paint, or showing them how it works. And then on the other side, we have a male figure here showing a different little cherub, a telescope, and we've got a globe here. So we've got kind of art on one side and mathematics on the other. And this could well have represented the two different wings of the building, because when the IRA was first developed, the idea is that one wing would be the boys and the other wing would be the girls. It perhaps maybe also signifies maybe some of the kind of prejudices that they had at the time, where we've got the boys doing the mathematics and the geography while the girls were doing the painting, but maybe that's a discussion for another day. Let's look at the top of the gables, and again we can see musical instruments here with these winged, they don't quite look like cherubs here, but these winged figures here with some music and some violins. And then on the other side, difficult really to make out what this is depicting. We've got some flowers, vegetation. I'm not sure if it's somehow related to agriculture or biology, botany perhaps, in relation to the sciences there. If we look at the two end gables, then round the corner, there's one here. I'm not sure if you can see, but on the other, there are two arrows, one at either side of the building, but one of mine is obscured by people from Zoom, so I'm not sure if you can see that. But we'll go to one. We'll start on the one that's on the north side here, and you'll see what we have a wee cherub here that is scattering some seeds. And then if we could quickly go around to the other side, and I'm sorry I don't have a better photograph of this, but I couldn't get one because the building is now covered in scaffolding. But this is a depiction of a cherub who's reaping the harvest. So there's a kind of an allegorical narrative there where you start at one end of the school and you kind of plant your seed, and then with good weather and good nurturing, when they come out of the school at the other end, you kind of reap the reward of this wonderful education that you receive in the school. There's a couple of other details here that we're going to have a quick look at. One is these candelabra mullions here, which don't really make much sense. I think they're a hangover from what some of the ideas they were developing at the foundry building down in Rose Street, because there doesn't seem to be any purpose or reason to have them there. Perhaps they're just there for fun, who knows. The other thing to look at is these wonderful recessed details. Again, we're looking at the transitional period to the arts and crafts. And this is very different from what has gone before, where cornices were projected outwards, and they have these big console brackets that used to project out over the building and overhang the facade of the building. In this instance, we're cutting back into the face of the building. So it's kind of, we're inverting the whole process. And you can see that we have these scallop details up at the top of the buttresses here. So we're seeing the introduction of lots of new ideas and techniques and ways of designing things, which would have been quite new. And I think this may be coming much more from the Macbeth side than from the Ross side. When the IRA was initially designed, it was intended to have two wings in addition to the central block that is there at the moment. But due to various cost issues that the IRA was struggling with at the time, they had to lose the two wings to make the budget work. Later in, I think it was 1913, Robert Macbeth was asked to come back and build out additional accommodation for the IRA. At this stage, the partnership between Alexander Ross and Robert Macbeth had dissolved. But you can see that Ross and that Robert Macbeth is still reusing an awful lot of the details that we have seen in the original Academy building. We can see this scalloped parapet along the top of the roofs. We can see these tops of these buttresses with the scalloped inverted detailing here. What you can also see is that there's not quite the same amount of detail. We've lost some of the mullions and transoms in the stonework, and we haven't got these panels filled with the sculptural reliefs, which I'm sure Alexander Ross would have insisted on if he'd been around or been involved in this part of the project. But by this stage, the architectural landscape was changing, and there was much more of an interest in kind of more restrained design detailing work, where sculpture was kind of less popular, and it was much more about kind of the honest portrayal of materials, which was again this influence of the arts and crafts movement. So it could have been budgetary, it could have been kind of the design influences and the evolving landscape that was there at the time.